So Joel Gruber is a scholar of religion. And in a recent article, he wrote about the life of America's best-selling poet, Jalaluddin Rumi. It's an interesting story how Rumi, a 13th century Muslim, became America's favorite poet. I'm sure that there is a sermon in just that fact alone, that we love a theological poet in a non-theological age, and that we embrace a Muslim in a country that often fears Islam. But for today, I want to hold up one part of Rumi's life, a part that Gruber mentions in his article. He writes, "You may not know that Rumi was an immigrant, a refugee who had to flee northeastern Iran along with his entire family and community. He was only a preteen during this mass exodus brought about by the massacre and destruction of the Mongol invasion. Jalaluddin's family and the other refugees moved westward, making the 3,000-mile journey to Konya in modern-day Turkey. With the arrival of the best and brightest in Konya, which was at the time a newly Islamicized polity, it became the new center of Islamic culture and learning. Jalaluddin Rumi was pivotal in putting Konya on the map. To this day, it is a pilgrimage destination for many who love his works. Arriving as a teenager, he was educated there in theology, and in his 20s, he started his own teaching and writing career as a theologian and a poet." Now, I think about this fact of Rumi's biography, this fact of his migrant status, when I hear the words of a particular poem, words that we sung in hymn form today. "Come, come, whoever you are, ours is no caravan of despair. Come yet again, come." To write those words as a person who traveled a dangerous 3,000 miles in a caravan is an amazing thing to me. That after exposure to blistering sun and probably water and food shortages, contending with unwelcoming communities and wild animals, and facing uncertainties about whether the group would be welcomed at their destination and even whether they would make it to their destination at all, that in spite of all of that, Rumi could refuse the despair of the journey and pen those hopeful words. That is a stunning thing to me. Indeed, if we did not have that context of Rumi's life as an immigrant, a refugee, we might not be able to appreciate the fortitude and the courage, perhaps even the defiance of his circumstances contained in those words. Now, if Rumi offers hopefulness and fortitude, then Sweet Honey in the Rock, which we will hear our choir sing shortly, offers a starker view. Their take on the immigrant experience highlights its precarity. It demonstrates the uncertainty of survival and the dependency on the hospitality of others. Would you harbor me? Would I harbor you? Would you harbor a Christian, a Muslim, a Jew, a heretic, convict, or spy? Would you harbor a runaway woman or child, a poet, a prophet, a king? Would you harbor an exile or a refugee? Would you harbor me? Would I harbor you? The questions are not answered in that song, and instead they just hang there, not, I think, as a rhetorical exercise, but instead as a sort of desperate query, pleadingly, plaintively, would you harbor me? Would you? Would you? In our current political climate, the answer is, I fear, more often than not, no. No, we would not harbor you. Several weeks before the U.S. midterms, a large caravan of people from Central America began wending its way to the United States. Images continue to flood the news media of this large group, and it is unfortunate, if not unsurprising, that in election season, this became a subject of both rhetoric and fear. Elected officials and candidates have suggested that caravans such as this one are fronts for violent gangs. They are, in other words, creating a humanitarian Trojan horse stuffed full of narcotics and organized crime. Such rhetoric has motivated a militia to now travel to the border to barricade it from the encroaching caravan. Now, many news outlets seem more interested in promoting these fears than in sussing the reasons for such large groups of people to make this dangerous trek over thousands of miles to an uncertain future. But the reason for the exodus is not mysterious. The crisis of politics and economics in Honduras has caused this, and the U.S. is partly to blame. As an article in the journal America puts it, a U.S.-backed president and economic policies have increased poverty and allowed crime to flourish in Honduras. This is causing people to flee the country in droves. Asylum seekers from Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala jumped from 7,600 in 2014 to almost 32,000 last year, and they now account for about a quarter of all asylum seekers in the U.S. Many of these people are desperately seeking harbor and humanitarian aid because their lives depend upon it. The question that is now urgent for us is this: how will we respond? How will we respond? Now, the Hebrew Scriptures are absolutely shot through with stories about harboring the stranger. One of these, which may be somewhat of a surprise, is the story from Genesis 19 that Bill read an excerpt from just a moment ago. It's the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, this is not often told as a parable about welcoming the stranger. Instead, it has been twisted into an excuse to further exclude and degrade gay and lesbian people. But historically, it has nothing to do with same-sex relationships. It is instead a story about harboring the refugee, the traveler, the immigrant who has been excluded from the community's protection. The details of the story are familiar. Two men show up in a town after wandering through dry, rough terrain. They have no place to stay, and they decide to sleep in the square. They appear to be refugees, immigrants from some far place. One resident steps forward and says, "Yes, I will harbor you. I will protect you." Afraid for their lives if they stay out in the streets, this man invites them in and gives them sustenance. In short order, the host hears the knock on the door that he has been dreading. He looks over at the boards of the door that are shaking under the force of the fist that is pounding upon it. It is the men of the town, forming something of a militia, insisting that the house's owner turn out the two men that he is harboring. They intend to have their way with the strangers, meaning the infliction of violence and humiliation. With shaking hands, the owner of the house refuses the request of the townspeople. He first puts his family and then himself between the strangers and the angry townsmen. It is only then, at the moment that he is about to be brutalized for his hospitality, that the strange refugees reveal themselves to be angels. The parable's brilliance comes at the end, I think, when these angels strike the town blind. I don't read that as a punishment or even as a convenient narrative device to protect Lot's house. I think it is instead a way of saying inhospitality already contains its own form of violence inside of it. It is the inability to see the spark of divinity in the other, the gift that this other might bring. Will you harbor us? No, the townspeople respond. No, we won't harbor you. They were speaking to angels. The recent coverage of the migrant caravan often ignores root causes and policy, as I mentioned. But the biggest problem that I have with it, which is a problem I have with many such stories, is that the faces of the real people who are caught up in it are obscured in abstract debates. Now, one of the better pieces that I have read about this Exodus was published this week in the Washington Post. Cutting through the abstraction of policy and rhetoric, it focuses on the journey of one family. It's called Finding a Way to America by Kevin Sullivan and Maya Averbach. And I'd like to read a selection of that piece here. Just before dawn on a hot morning, Ingrid Hernandez Mija, a fast food cook from rural Honduras, stands in line with dozens of other migrants, almost all from Central America, on a pedestrian bridge leading to the U.S. border. She has no passport. She wears clothes that were donated by strangers. If the U.S. agents admit her 2-year-old daughter, Frances, and her 17-year-old son, Moises, she knows they will spend weeks in detention. She hears on the news that U.S. officials are taking children from their parents. What if they take hers? She has traveled in a caravan from Honduras for 2 months with her husband and 3 kids in buses, trains, and trucks, or walking, at this point more than 2,700 miles, heading north to flee gangs that had killed her brother and then began threatening her children. Ingrid and her husband, Misael, have been looking for a way out of Honduras since her brother's killing. Within days of his death, they said that they started getting phone calls, texts, and then Facebook messages. Ingrid said the callers mistakenly thought that her brother had left her money and they wanted it. "We will kill you," they said to her. Even when she changed her number, the calls continued. Then someone fired a gun at her house, so they moved. But strange people kept coming around the new place. The threats never stopped. They moved twice more. Men threatened Moises in a park, and so he had to change schools. Eventually, he dropped out. Imagine one day going to work, his dad says, and you have this fear that when you come home, your kids might have been kidnapped or killed. Ingrid had asked the police in her Honduran hometown for protection, but she didn't know the names of those who threatened to kill her and who confronted her teenage son at school, demanding money that they believed that the brother had left. "We can't fight ghosts," a policeman told her, and dropped her case. It was in that moment that Ingrid knew, we will never be safe in my country. So she and her husband, Misael Jorge Bonilla, took their 3 children, $400 in cash, birth certificates, a photo of Ingrid's slain brother face down in the dirt, hands tied behind his back, and newspaper clippings about his killing, and began their first steps to the United States. The plan was to ask for asylum, safety, and a new life. Ingrid's father had lived in the Bronx for 2 decades and was offering them a place to start fresh, if they could make it. If they could make it. Now, Moises was particularly hopeful. After he was threatened, he had to drop out of school, as I mentioned. But upon entering the United States, Moises says that he wants to finish school and then find a career. He doesn't know what yet, but he is only 17. I can't help but remember that Rumi was only a teenager when he left northeastern Iran. This family on this journey is poised between hope and precarity, fortitude and danger. At some moments, there is evidence of optimism. Perhaps they are joining a caravan of hope rather than a caravan of despair. But at other times, the fear and the precarity of it, of the family being split apart or refused at the border, is palpable. If you're interested in reading about their experience and what happens to them, I highly recommend the article. It humanizes an experience that can be lost in abstraction and policy debate. After all, it is Ingrid and Misael, Moises and Francis who are asking for harbor. It is their lives that we are welcoming or turning away. It is their story that is calling out for attention. Would you harbor me? Would you? Would you? And then something else, too. Something that haunts, a failure that lingers. I cannot help but think of that old story and its hard lessons, like leaves that blow over graves and voices that whisper from long ago, urging us not to forget those strangers who were refused hospitality. Those were not just strangers. They had the spark of the divine within them. They were angels. If the town had provided for them, the town would have gained, but the residents were too blind to see that. Untold contributions were missed in favor of the pleasure of cruelty and the fear of the other. The story reminds us, calls to us, pleads with us. It asks us to hear the question, would you harbor me? And ponder the response ever so carefully. Listen for it, for the answer is as crucial for the one being asked as it is for the one doing the asking.